is another installment of Strength for Today and Bright Hope for Tomorrow, God's vision for the next United Methodist Church. And I'm delighted to talk today with one of my oldest friends and partners in crime in United Methodism from the early days on. And boy, a lot of water's gone under that bridge, Michael. But this is Michael Beck, who is now Dr. Michael Beck and is traveling the country and the world trying to help the church see how it can be relevant again, how it can crack open some of the walls around it. I remember years ago, Michael, you freaking out because people in your church didn't want to go along with you. And I had the pleasure as a superintendent to go in and say, y'all need to follow him.
You did.
I think that there is some institutional support. We aren't all rigid administrators, but there are ways we can speak into the life of congregations and help them to follow good leadership and to see a different way, and to invite them to join the rigid church down the street if they really don't want to change their ways, right? So anyhow, Michael, it's always a pleasure. And I wanted to talk to you because, I've been in 3 very complex, large annual conferences of the United Methodist Church. I kind of get caught up in the lives of those annual conferences, but you've been all over. You've seen small, large, rural, and I kind of would like just to your brain as to what do you see that's hopeful and what do you see that's deadly as we move into the next chapter of United Methodism. So welcome, and we'll see where this conversation leads.
Yes. I remember when you had that sermon, you called it the Church of the Joyous Shepherd, and then you had a meeting with the wild ones after, and you're like, this is going to happen, so let it go. And that actually turned the whole corner in that congregation where a lot of new things started to happen after that. So I always appreciate you for that. And I remember way back when I was given a contingency, and I just feel sorry for you. You had to work with me on my theology paperwork. You're like,
well, your
you got a lot of
theology
work
was
to do.
involved too, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So tell us what gives you hope and what you need. Leaders in the church, folks yearning for a different way, what's helpful? What have you learned over the past? And I think St. Mark is a great crucible. That's a congregation I know well. And, how, and it's hard, right? It's not for the faint-hearted, right?
That's right. So I had a couple things, and you just stop me and tell me where to go as we go along.
Okay.
But I thought the key things I think that give me hope that's happening right now on the ground is the blended ecology of church and really a widespread kind of embracing that. I think COVID and disaffiliation mayhem has got people to the point in recovery. We call this the gift of desperation.
Yeah.
Where we come to that place like, okay, we get it. We need to try some new stuff and be willing to change and change our lives. So there's that. So this idea that an ecology of church is necessary, that the inherited traditional church is beautiful, it's good, it's true, we need it to be healthy. And we need these little missional experiments, these little forms of church that are connected to that, living in symbiotic relationship, which I think is the deepest story of United Methodism, right? It started in Susanna Wesley's kitchen with the first fresh expression ever, and which had more people coming to that than who were coming to church on Sunday. But and when her husband Samuel tried to stop her, she was like, "You come and stop me, try it, you'll have these souls on your hands." But so we were born out of that kind of that impulse of like, people are not coming, so how do we create community with them where they are? And I just think Methodism's always had a version of that with field preaching and societies, classes, and bands taking place outside of formal church spaces, but, going to the miners' camps and all those things. So I feel like the blended ecology releases that again. And then for that to thrive, really, I think lay empowerment is the key. Figuring out to do new creative stuff with our spaces that'll be missional, that our places won't be just places that we use for an hour on Sundays, but they'll be missional places.
Yeah.
And that'll generate revenue too. And
I saw a presentation recently, and the average for most United Methodist churches, their facilities are used 10 to 15% of the week. If you look at 9 in the morning to 9 at night, 15%. So you have a great resource there. And I've always been frustrated that churches every year don't just look at all of their space and facility and say, are we doing what God's calling us to do? Or are we just doing the same thing we've always done? Because there's always a new way. And space is so vital, and gathering is so vital. So how do we help other folks do that? Yeah, that's critical.
Yeah, can I share a little story about that?
Yeah.
So you were instrumental in the St. Mark's becoming what it is, Open Arms Village. So this is a little story of hope. And I can't tell you the feeling that I get to stand in the place where I was baptized as a baby every Sunday and to preach to the people who were there at my infant baptism, and their eyes are so full of hope and joy. And we just celebrated over 100 people in attendance in our 3 services on Sunday for the first time. It's not the people. That's a lot for us, by the way. I know that's very small.
No, that church is good. Yeah.
But is it the people they had always prayed for? We have a service, we have a rap song, we have a bunch of people in recovery who maybe if they put $1 in the bucket, that's a huge commitment, a big move forward in their discipleship. Right. So it's not exactly what people had dreamed of, what the kinds of people that would fill the space, but the space is full. But literally every day, Sue, and you know this because you created this at St. Mark's, but the space is used every day. People come to the food pantry, the food distribution, they come to meetings. There's 2 dedicated clubhouses. The parsonage is now a halfway house, a step-up house where men live and pay rent. We turned another little building into the Nest that can house more men. Open Arms Village, for those that are unfamiliar, it's a program for men experiencing homelessness, and they go through a year-long process of kind of recovery, and they live in the church campus every day. So, and then we have a sanctuary where we still have a traditional service and all of that happening. So every day, literally, the space is used. And now through the grants that we get through the hospital district in Ocala and funding, we can, as a church, thrive because we have rent coming in from the halfway house and space usage things. And then we turn the pastor's office into a counseling center where Davion can do his practice there. And then that generates revenue. So now we're actually financially sustainable, not trying to rely on the plate donations, which we would never make it if that's what we were relying on.
Yeah. And I think that that's going to be a key to the future, right? That the whole notion that a church is, pays its pastor and supports its budget by people in the pews. That works in some places. It works, sadly, that's how the church has been built, right? Let's go to those affluent suburbs so we can fill the coffers. But for the people who John Wesley was most concerned about, we got to have, and Michael, one thing that I'm disturbed about is this whole Congregationalist move. Like, we want to keep our money because it's our money and we don't want to give to the big evil, institution. But, as I read Acts, Paul was always asking them, send to support my new mission, right? We if we're going to have church for everybody, we've got to have different funding mechanisms and we should, with great joy, give, not just so our own church can be sustained, but so places like St. Mark, places where, I think of just how many congregations, especially like our Haitian congregations in Florida, or, the poorest areas that I would argue need the church the most aren't supported if you don't have some sort of connectional giving. So that's a plug for, it's about we, right? I think the United States and the church in general, we've lost the whole notion of we, that we survive, and that, it's not us and them. And I heard that a lot in churches I serve, right? Do we have to invite them? Can't we just do something for us? And finally, luckily, the culture of the church shifted enough where everybody in the church was outraged and said, there is no us and them. It's all us. And our
Yeah.
whole job is to figure out how to bring more of us into community, right? So, and I think that's the heart of Fresh Expressions. Open your eyes to the people around you who for whatever reason have been considered them for too long. So,
Yeah, yeah. And I think of like what the Holy Spirit, told Peter, go with them and make no distinction between them and us
right,
in
right.
Acts,
For
right?
God shows no partiality, right?
That's right.
So I
But
think
I,
that
I wonder if what you said there is just the broken connectionalism, which I think is one of the gifts that Methodism and our polity, which is the outflow of our missional impulse to work together and to be a network and to,
right,
have relationships. I don't know that somewhere down the line that broke, right? And that's been real clear with disaffiliation and
right.
bigger churches that were actually just congregational, right? Polity.
Yeah.
And then they're like, we don't need you, even
But
though,
what's sad is those congregations, and I've served large churches, they're the ones who could really fuel the most change, right? They could be the blessing to so many. But so
yes,
many of them are like, no, we need to have our own money and our own stuff. And I don't know. I think it's not Christian. It's not at its heart Christian. I mean, our whole point is that we are sacrificial and that we give sacrificially and that I've always understood as a United Methodist, if there's anybody in my region that doesn't know Christ, the churches that exist are responsible for that. And so I think it's a reflection of American culture. I think it's a reflection on just our desire to acquire, and more is better. And let's face it, and we could talk for another hour or two on just the rise of the megachurch and a lot of the really, I think, immature spirituality of those churches. And a lot of those leaders have crashed and burned because they bought into a system and a way of life that wasn't of Christ. And so how do we move? I get asked all the time, how come United Methodism doesn't have a lot of mega churches? And I think that's not how we're wired, right? We're wired into community. And years ago I read it was Natural Church Development, which has kind of fallen out of favor, but one sentence in that book, they did research on churches all over the world, and one of their findings was that the ideal number of people to make disciples for Jesus Christ is 200.
mm,
It makes sense, doesn't it? Because you can
yes.
cultivate community. And so I'm really delighted to be in the Virginia Annual Conference where most of our churches are right at 200, 300. We don't have huge churches like we had in North Georgia, but I think they link it. It's easier to link into community with 200 people than with 1,000 who see their church as a destination. So,
Yeah. And I wonder if one of the things about the blended ecology is kind of subversive in the American culture, the polarization, extremism stuff that's happening, is it actually awakens a new kind of connectionalism that brings back a kind of a circuit rider thinking of the world as our parish.
right,
So it's an ecosystem of churches within one congregation even, but then connected to a larger ecosystem of churches in a conference, a district, and so on.
right,
And the clergy function more as like not the producer of religious goods and services who spoon feeds the people their spiritual butler, but
right.
we actually deploy, empower, activate the whole people of God. And then I show up at Tattoo Parlor Church when it's time for communion, and
Right.
at higher power hour in the rehab on Monday nights. I'm not the leader. I'm there because I want to encourage, cheerlead, Jordan and Chase and what they're doing in their work there. And that's a shift I think we have to make, but that creates like a new kind of connectionalism. And like those 100 people that are coming to St. Mark's on Sunday mornings, it's not because the preaching's great or because we have amazing facilities or a light,
Right. Right.
fog show and lights. We have none of that and no staff and a quarter-time pastor. But those people are people who connected in those different things. And they're like, oh, this, brings meaning and purpose to my life. And I think there's just this overall, the social, studies that show isolation is the great soul wound of our time. And we've never really
Yeah.
been more alone even though we're more connected than ever, but people are just lonely, the epidemic of loneliness. And we have a gift for that, right? Communal life in Jesus that heals that isolation, that heals, that creates real relationships. But that's not people aren't necessarily finding that by just showing up on Sunday mornings and doing that. So we
Right.
got to create those little pockets of communal life in Jesus in the world.
Well, and it takes work, right? It makes demands on me. um I got tired of people saying, well, I just would rather watch online, or I don't need to be there every Sunday, we've got stuff going on. And then I think, but it's not about, once again, it's not about you. There are people who are hurting coming there for ministry, and the pastor's not your hired hand to do it. We need you there to
Yes.
be Christ, the body of Christ. It doesn't say like the one pastor of Christ sitting in a location waiting for anybody who might come in. It's the body of Christ. And I can tell you, though, from my perspective, I bash the mega churches, and they've done good. Don't get me wrong. They've done, a lot of people have been, led to Christ through mega churches. But that's not to say our tiny churches are all great guns either. A lot of family chapels, a lot of little social clubs, a lot of just mean congregations. I've seen them. And I used to, every candidate for ministry that I mentored, I'd have to say, because they came out of vibrant churches, right? That's the catch-22. Vibrant churches produce clergy. And if you don't have vibrant churches, you don't have clergy, because there's nothing appealing about not vibrant churches. And so I would have to sit with these clergy who came out of vibrant churches and say, you realize that your first appointment is probably not going to be like anything you've ever been accustomed to.
Yeah.
And a lot of those churches would just beat them up or frustrate them to no end because they weren't willing to change anything. And I think we've lost a lot of those churches to disaffiliation or closure, because that doesn't sustain. So one thing I find hopeful is I'd much rather send a couple of clergy out excited into a community to start from scratch than to go into a rigid group of 20, 30, 40 people who just, poo-poo every idea they have and say, pat them on the head and say, look, we've been doing this for years and we know what we're doing. So I'm hopeful in that regard.
Yeah, I wonder if I have a different, like maybe could move to a pain point on this one, or one of the things that concerns me is I'm not sure. So I see a lot of people come into faith in these like contextual communities, fresh expressions. I'm not sure we know what to do with them. Like personally,
I agree. Yeah.
I've had a couple go in front of DCOM and they're like, yeah, I came to faith in the tattoo parlor or the burrito place and I want to do that. That's
Right.
I feel called to do that. And then the DCOM's like, so you want a church? We got lot. And they're like, no, I don't want that.
See, that's the challenge, I think, of the future. And I'd really love to get a bunch of folks together and just, well, that's the pioneer process, right? At least in England, they figured out you have a whole different track of ministry for those folks.
Yes.
And those are the folks we should be looking to lead the church, right? In new ways and new moving out. And, it's the same thing I hear, Michael. I spend a lot of time with campus ministries. And
Yeah.
all of them, they have great community. They have life-giving time together. They have really good campus ministers. But boy, when it's time for them to go out and find a church, there's nothing there. They find the same rigidity, the same old ideas, the same, you'll love this. When we got to First Ocala, a bunch of people were like, we're so excited because the old guard is letting us lead now. We finally get a chance to lead. And they were 55 years old.
Yeah.
So that's crazy, isn't it? It's like
Yes.
You got to work your way into leadership, and maybe when you're 55, we'll let you have a say. That's just crazy. So there's a whole lot about the church that needs to be upended.
Yeah. Yeah. And I hope we can catch up. And Bishop, please figure this out for us, because that pioneer panel in the UK, that's how they've actually been able to create more of a friendly blended ecology kind of system in the UK, because those folks go in front of a different group of people.
Right.
They don't have the same educational process. They don't have the same kind of appointment kind of situation.
Right.
So we got to figure that out pretty quick. We actually in United Methodism call our pioneers adventurers, and we locate that in a theology of Advent, right? We're living in this adventure between
Right.
Jesus coming today, coming at the end of time. So we're on this grand adventure of following him through this messy and beautiful, very good world. But yeah, those folks, young people that are really excited about this, and right now we just have one basically answer for them, and it's not fitting what they really actually are called to do.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
think those are the people who need to lead us into the new day. And I think that what I experienced with Fresh Expressions when I was in England, and I know we're going again next year, and I'm eager to see how it's shifted and moved and morphed.
Yeah.
But what I was impressed with was um, that's what I've always thought church should be, right? I was like, wow, this is how it was in Acts, right? That
Yes.
we go to third place where people hang out. Go to, too bad we don't get all our water from rivers anymore. I guess that's a good thing. But that was where you went, right? Where do people gather? Where can I develop community? But a community always organized to move outward, right? And I love the Acts church. They broke bread, they prayed, they had fellowship, they heard the word. And then the other beautiful part of it is, and they were regarded well by all around.
Mm.
And we've
Mm.
lost that, right? Because I think most people have such a bad image of the church right now that it's an uphill battle. So,
Yeah.
in some ways, sometimes at Global Ministries, I say, maybe we need to get rid of the word missionary because there's so much baggage to the word missionary. And I'm about to that point with the word church in the
Mm.
United States because I think people, when they think of church, just have the wrong idea.
Yeah, there's so many negative stereotypes that come with the baggage of that word that it's so hard to work around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to ecclesia or gathering place or something that, something that is life-giving, right? That doesn't suck the joy out of you, that isn't rigid, that isn't judgmental, that isn't evaluating you, and I knew when I was a pastoring churches, so many people would come to me and say, hey, I don't go to church now, but I'll come back when, I'm not living with my boyfriend anymore, or I'm sober, and I'm like, you really don't have to wait. And there was a sense that the church was all of these perfectly adjusted people, and somehow they weren't worthy. And I'm like, boy, that is so not the churches I know. So we got to
Yeah.
be on
Coming back to that idea of, lay empowerment and people at 55 at First Ocala, finally we can lead. Um,
they got out of the way. The 70 and 80-year-olds are going to let us do something. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's a pretty major problem. One of my students, Sarah Beth Wonk, she did a dissertation called Let Them Lead. And she looked at how young the early disciples were that followed Jesus, right? He was only 30 and they were mostly teenagers and
Well,
young
they
adults.
died at 40, so
Exactly. And in the early Methodist movement,
the
like,
circuit riders didn't live much past 30. So
right, right. So these were young people doing all this stuff and fully empowered. But the cool thing about Fresh Expressions, like I had a 70-year-old Larry have a similar reaction that you just shared, where he's like, oh, so I can start this church in a dog park. I mean, he planted a church at 70 years old, pause and praise.
yeah,
And he came alive in a new way in his discipleship. Like he's like, oh, I get my friends in the park. We do this simple little thing. Like his first spiritual conversation was, if God was a dog, what kind of dog would God be?
right.
Right. And so then he's talking about, well, God would be a Labradoodle because they're big and majestic and beautiful. And Jill and I were like, no, God would definitely be a pug because pugs have to be carried around and worshipped at all times. And we're having this
Yeah, you could go all day with that. Yeah,
all day, but we're orienting our thinking around God. We're out in nature, and he's pastoring this congregation, if you want to use that word. He's leading this little church, and he's been going to church his whole life. He served on every committee. He's been twice, right, and
right.
3 times, and now he's really coming alive. And so I think that with young people, old people, let's not dismiss folks who've been faithfully kind of holding the church down with their prayers present, they can do this too. Like we have a thing right now in Shenanigans in Brookdale here in Ocala where Iris is, and
Uh-huh.
now Miss Marty and several other people in there, Miss Edith. And they've started a little fresh expression in there called Shenanigans.
Right.
And we could have these little things everywhere, and the whole people of God
Well,
get.
I was just thinking years ago when we were in Cape Coral, Florida, we probably had 30 people in the local independent living moving into assisted living. And they, kept bugging Alan and me to come lead a Bible study there. So finally I said, okay, I'll come do that. And I got there, and the first week, Michael, I was about ready to bang my head against the wall because it was like 2 hours of hearing every little physical complaint they had. And when you got 80 and 90-year-olds, that could take all day, right? And
Yes.
they were very inwardly focused. What can you do for us? And so I went home and prayed and thought about it. So the next week I went and I said, look, we're not here to just listen to each other and commiserate. We're here to be agents for Jesus Christ. So let's talk about how we do that. And I just watched how it just changed their whole mission and vision, right? And that was a fresh expression, because what I loved after about 6 months, they were, coming and reporting on who was lonely in the cafeteria and hadn't spoken to anybody since they arrived there. And they befriended them. And that day he'd gone out with them. And, we prayed for different people who needed special prayer. They were the agents. They were the driving force. They were empowered to be Christ in that facility. And once they got that vision, it was a fresh expression, and they were off to the races, and they did untold amazing work there. But I think that in a nutshell is what, yeah. And some of the best disciples, I mean, I know a woman who, till the day she died at like 97, made encouraging phone calls to people. So clearly we just have to say, you don't get to retire from serving Jesus. You don't get to, there's no limit on how much work you can do if you just pick a place, right? Pick a school, pick a nursing home. There's enough ministry there to last forever. So just do it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I get some pushback around, my life is so full, my life is so busy. I can't add anything else to my life. And now I got, maybe church meetings on top of all that or whatever. And I like to say to people, don't add anything to your life.
Mm-hmm.
What do you already do every week?
Right.
Who do you do that with?
Right.
What do you enjoy doing? Like you would do it even if no one else showed up. Like I would eat burritos and all you can eat chips and salsa if it was just me and Jill, right?
Yeah. Right.
The fact that 20, 30 other people gather and do that with us, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But so I'm not adding, I'm not trying to and what is your passion, your interest, your hobbies, and think about those little things as ways to create community.
Right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that actually, helps people think about following Jesus in a different way, that it's not just this thing that I come to and I get the, goods and services and then I go back to life. And it's
Right.
actually, we're thinking about who are my people and what are my places that I care about and what are the third places I like to hang out in, and do I have a person of peace in that place that's welcoming us to,
Right.
create something together.
Well,
Yeah.
I know we fought the traveling ball battle all the time, you know.
Yeah.
And it kind of reached a head when the national volleyball finals were on Easter Sunday in Denver. I was like, that's just sad, right? That I can't believe enough people didn't say, wait a minute, we need to be in our place of worship on Easter. But instead of just wailing and flailing and being annoyed about it, I finally decided, okay, how can I be helpful in this? So we had a couple whose family was involved in traveling swimming, and they went all over. And they
Hmm.
came to me one day and they said, hey, we hate it that this is on Sunday so much. Would you help us craft some worship opportunities every Sunday?
Hmm.
And so they did. And they started, more and more people started gathering, and they would pray together, and they were all focused and so, interested in swimming. But they had a worshiping community, and they, started having some sort of outreach between them. But I think that, you know, the more I'm in this, the more I think God calls us to be creative and to look for opportunities where we might see roadblocks.
Yes.
And that's what this couple did. So how can, and I see our job more and more is resourcing and equipping. I loved it that they came to me and said, hey, help us with worship. Help us. How do you write a worship service? How do we do this in a way that's life-giving? So, that to me, and I think most pastors, that makes their hearts sing, right? I mean, I've been in ministry for 15 years before a woman came to me and said, Pastor Sue, I don't know how to pray. Could you help me with that? Like, yes, yes. So, but it's appalling how many people ask you about really important matters of faith, right? It's like they come to see you and complain about the carpet color or, I don't know. So how do we get back to what's important? And I think Fresh Expressions, at least that kind of focus helps you focus on what your real mission is and what's important. And John Wesley said, you have nothing to do but to save souls, right? I think John Wesley would go, yeah, you got a preschool, that's fine, but are you saving souls through that preschool? Or are you, every activity of the church, are you saving souls? Are you connecting people to Jesus Christ? And if you're not, it needs to fall by the wayside, or you've gotten lost in the institution, right? And I always laugh when people call me institutionalist, because I'm always putting a fork in the institution and saying, no, it's not right. So, yeah, but that gets you a whole different set of enemies. So anyhow.
It does. Yes, it does.
So, we're going to go next year and look at some places in England and see the Fresh Expression movement firsthand. And so we're working on that brochure, and I just wanted to put that out there. And I'm really eager to see. I think nothing lit me up like seeing those communities. And really, the people I met over there are still so memorable. And I think if I had to just, in a nutshell, say what I loved about it was it always sought the direction of the Holy Spirit, right? I think too many of our churches are going through the motions and spending too little time asking God, how are you sending us? How are you directing us? And that was at the heart of Fresh Expressions, right? Where's God leading us? What's the Holy Spirit doing? And how do we follow wherever it leads, as crazy as it may seem? So.
Yeah, and that's coming up, the England Immersion 2024, September 1st through September 13th. Can't wait for that.
Yeah.
I had the same kind of experience where we were huddled together with this little group of Anglicans, and they're in the shadow of this big, massive cathedral that nobody comes to on Sundays anymore.
Right.
But they're meeting with their toddlers, and they're hanging out and having tea and doing a liturgy and taking communion, the Lord's Supper. And I was like, this is what probably early Methodism looked like. Like, I'm experiencing that right now for the first time. And I've been, United Methodist my whole life, and then to see just the diversity, like in London, of all the different expressions and how many kinds of people are involved in all that. And to know, like, here's the historic spaces where Susanna Wesley did this or John Wesley did that. Yeah. And it's like, here's the modern thing that's happening right now. That's like a recapitulation of that in the 21st century. But yeah.
So tell us about your latest book and how can that be helpful in all of this work?
Absolutely. So yeah, like you, I like how you refer to yourself as like a triage specialist pastor. You went to the churches that weren't doing great,
Yeah.
So
no, people were not lining up to get the churches I was appointed to. I'm pretty clear on that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So Jill and I have a similar kind of ministry. We've never been sent to a church that was like, people were lining up to come to. And so this book, 5 Congregational Personality Types, is what it looks like, by the way, for anybody.
Very good.
But, we spend a lot of time as clergy kind of understanding our personalities, and we take all these APES tests and all these different things. But I feel like a mistake I made a lot in my ministry was not taking the time to learn the personality of the congregation. and understanding what their heart was, what their values were, what their culture was, and just kind of come in and the way that I lead and do that without taking that time. So I found this really interesting correlation between the APES, that's Ephesians 4, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, teachers. And there's this thing in psychology called the 5-factor model. And it's trait psychologists. It's the test that they use to define personality. So they distill all these thousands of human personality traits into these 5: agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. And I was like, oh, those lay right over the APES perfectly, because apostles are open to the spirit and creativity and different things that are happening. Evangelists are obviously extroverted in most circumstances.
Yeah.
Prophets, usually neurotic. You can have a high neuroticism prophet like Jeremiah, who's flailing himself and wearing belts and stuff. And then like a low neuroticism prophet like Jesus, who's emotive and feels and weeps and all that, but he's not necessarily like a Jeremiah type. And then you have obviously pastors who are agreeableness and cultivating communities of kindness and developing people. And then you have the didaskalos, the teachers who are conscientious and they're about right teaching and passing on the faith from generation to generation. And then I found like every congregation I've served has a primary kind of personality. I don't know if maybe it's connected to the founder or the different leaders they've had over time, but I name those as like proclamation-centered congregations, outreach-centered congregations, fellowship congregations, generosity congregations, and healing congregations, which are come out of the APEST, those 5 types.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. And every congregation has like a really strong, so I like to preach and I get really excited about preaching, but you know, at La Clusa, they're like, Pastor, about 15 minutes, 20 at the most, can you pull the ripcord on the sermon, you know, land the plane, that's a wrap, because we really want to go over to the fellowship hall and have our fried food, you know, potluck gathering.
Right.
So they were a fellowship congregation, so it didn't really matter how great I preached, they weren't really feeling it. But if I love them in their gift set and in their culture and their personality, then I found they were kind of willing to follow us. And then we started a church and a barbecue place together, right?
Right.
Taking that time to know them and understand that personality. So the book tries to give that, and there's an assessment. I think it's like the first congregational personality assessment ever, where you can take it and know and then that helps congregations have a conversation like, we're probably this, and we've got some areas to grow here. Because each one has a strength and a dark side. So if I'm a fellowship congregation, that can become really internal, and it's about us being together in quality time.
Yeah.
There's no outreach component, right? Or so that it helps us understand, here's some growth places that we have.
Well, and it would be helpful for appointment, right?
Yes. Yes.
You send in you know, like a geek teacher type to just a fellowship or an outreach, and they're like, who are you? But I have read of a pastor who was a teacher, and they were like, we don't like this, but they were very mission oriented, so he just learned how to teach missional stuff, right? That ate that up. So I think that would be a helpful thing to think about from appointment as well. How do we help a congregation in its weaknesses or dark side, but at the same time acknowledge that they are strong in these areas? So yeah, I think it'll be a helpful discussion for cabinets to have as they're looking at, okay, let's describe this church. So
yeah, I wish I had a bishop who would utilize this book in assessment.
Well, you know what? I think probably you might have a willing audience here, but no, I think that you know, I'm one of those widely read, whatever will help, let's figure out and use it. And one size doesn't fit all. And how do we, you know, and I think that's the beauty of God's diverse creation, right? We don't want churches that are all the same, and we don't want you know, that's the beauty of this. So how are we using our uniqueness to reach those out there who resonate as well? And the challenge is ever before us. And I think the church, like you said, now realizes we're in a new day. And it's not going to, you know, we can either longingly look back to 1950, which had its huge issues as well,
Mhm.
or we can move forward. And I think Acts gives us kind of the ground rules. And I think Fresh Expressions gives us the hunger and the desire to go back to that. And is it perfect? No. Are there failures in Fresh Expressions? Yes. Are there, like anything, how do we look at this in a way that is realistic, but we can leverage it? And clearly, um, people have benefited all over the world from just having fresh eyes and fresh attitudes.
Yeah, and I don't want to come off like I'm saying Fresh Expressions is the answer to everything. And
Mm-mm.
I do want to note that there are earlier movements like the base ecclesial communities in Latin America, which are Fresh Expressions
Yes, yes,
movement. That's 80s and 90s coming out of liberation theology, and really lots of similarities. But I will say there's a thing in Fresh Expressions that we teach that I think is the essential thing. And it's not the answer to every problem, it's not the answer to every context, but we teach this listening, loving and serving, building relationships, sharing our faith in non-sketchy ways, and then see if a little organic church can spring out of that. And I think if we do that, actually, we actually just start little faith communities accidentally almost. Because
yeah,
if we really listen, if we really love the people where we are, and we really build relationships over time slowly, things just kind of emerge and spring out of that. And I'm not in any way like I love the inherited church. This little church that I serve now, was my orphanage. They saved my life. They rallied around me,
mhm,
committed to raise me in a community of love and forgiveness. And they did that, you know. And Miss Shirley, she was playing the organ at my infant baptism,
right,
and she's still playing it today.
yeah,
But to try to lead revitalization in that congregation, it's really, really hard in the conventional ways that we've taught. Like if you just
right,
preach better or you just have better discipleship
yeah,
systems,
no,
it just doesn't work anymore.
right,
So
right,
if we don't go out and do these kind of things, call it whatever you want, but we're connecting with people outside the church, we're loving them, we're building relationships. And we do see the inherited congregations come back to life over time.
mhm,
It's not the goal of it, it's actually to be with people that are never going to come to church and love them and build relationships. But we do, every inherited church I've seen do it comes back to life
yeah,
in new ways. And maybe it's not ways that they even would have
right,
wanted.
right, yeah. Yeah, I know. I remember one of those churches I served. Oh, they were so mad at me. And one of the old guard, she's like, I don't want crowds of people here. I like my little church. I like my seat. And, and that was the mentality, why would we want anybody else here? But the
Yeah.
community was growing and there were new people. And that church only, I realized that they feared a huge mob of people walking through the door, but one person at a time they could handle, right? And
Mm.
so I think the
Mm.
shifting point in that church is when they decided to open their doors to a YMCA after school program. And in God's economy, the daughters of one of the old guard in the church was the director. And she started pointing out that there were hungry children, that children were asking for food to take home. And that just outraged the church. They're like, you mean in our community there are hungry children? There are children who are not cared for. There are children who are left alone every day. And that cracked the door.
Mm.
And they just had such an outpouring of love for those families. And they started joining. And I think, over 5 years, probably 80 people joined, which, the average worship attendance was 130. So that was a big number. But one at a time, they welcomed them. And so I think part of it's finding, what can I do to crack the door to help these folks see the need around, to see, because they were a loving people. They just never been taught how to love anybody who wasn't their blood relative. And
Yeah.
that was a huge shift. So it shouldn't be threatening, right? We got to make it um, inviting
Yeah.
and joyous um, and like you say, kind of not sketchy, but in ways that sometimes you have to sneak up on them, right? And the Holy
Yeah.
Spirit will give you those ways if you just open yourself. So I would say to anybody watching this, take heart
Hmm.
and start listening, get out in your community, go hang out, and just ask God to show you inroads and be prepared to follow. That's how this whole movement got started. And I also say all the time, it just doesn't cost a lot of money for one person to tell another person about Jesus. It just doesn't. But we've
Hmm.
made all of it require huge amounts of money. So, anyhow. Well,
Yeah.
Michael, I'll give you the final word. What's the biggest word of hope you can give me right now? And
Uh,
anybody watching?
yeah, I just think that United Methodists have a really beautiful gift to give to the world. I think that the way we go about like creating inclusive, grace-centered communities is what emerging generations are really longing for. And there's a rationality to our faith that like you don't have to check your brain at the door, kind of, that
Right.
outlier
There's no
quadrilateral.
science, right?
Yeah, you can actually believe in evolution and follow Jesus. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that just when I talk with young people, one of my favorite things that happens at dinner church or where is people say, so what are Methodists, and why do I care? And the first time somebody asked me that, I was like, oh shit, how do I say this without blowing everything up and making it weird? But now I kind of, I'm prepared to say, Methodists are people that saw pain in the world and wanted to make a difference. And they created a community and a movement around that that has created this denomination that we live in today. And just to try to frame it that way, people are like, okay, I'm down with
Right.
that.
Right.
And that is us. Like that's our gift. We have a unique thing to give to the world. And I'm just really excited and hopeful because it feels like it's really painful to I like there's people that I love deeply and they have left and our relationships are fragmented and that hurts. And
Mhm.
I feel like there's been some really dirty, underhanded, like basically proselytization of people and congregations, which is not right. It's not Christian.
Yeah.
What we're left with, though, I think is really committed people who they have been blessed by their life in the United Methodist Church.
Mhm.
And with that kind of passion and commitment, we can really do something cool to heal the world.
Yeah. 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 I think back to that early Joyous Shepherd sermon that I preached years ago, but
Yeah.
um, one image that's always captivated me, excuse me, is search parties, right? When a
Mhm.
child is missing and people are shoulder to shoulder and they just go out en masse so that no ground is left uncovered. And I think that's the connection at its finest and a good image for United Methodists, that we should be shoulder to shoulder going through our communities and nobody left behind, nobody lost. Anybody who wants to be gathered in can be gathered in. And that's my vision of the reign of God. So let's do it.
Let's do it.
Well,
Amen. It's
thank you, Michael
happening.
Beck. You've done a lot. I'm always amazed. I'm like, oh my gosh, from day one I met Michael Beck. I can't believe where he's ended up all over the world, but I'm proud of
Yeah.
you and I'm grateful for you. And
No more orange jumpsuits or
no more orange jumpsuits. Yeah, no more bad haircuts. So
the DOC edition
yeah,
haircuts.
yeah. Well, thank you much. Rock on, and we'll talk again soon. Appreciate it. Bye bye.
Thank you. Thank you.